Right, everybody, Dr. Keith on another podcast journey, and I think you're going to find this one is in a very strange place. We are going off into almost Lulu land, but it's fact, it's science. That's what's brilliant. You know, I had a friend at Salford University in Northern England, and he used to say, if only doctors understood advanced physics, they wouldn't have a problem. They'd realize and this is the key words, he'd say they'd realize these things are not only could happen, they must happen by the advanced laws of physics. And I think that's wonderful. Anyway, I'm going to be talking to my good buddy Roger Meacock, and he's got a special interest in this. Well, you see, we both have, really. I'm going to be quoting from Medicine Beyond, and he's going to be quoting from one of his favorite scientists, philosophers, a Russian guy, now no longer with us. But anyway, since you don't know my friend, I'm going to ask him to introduce you. Rog, I know I've known you for what, 20 years? It's 20 odd years anyway. I know who you are, but the other people don't. Please tell us, what do you do? What is your justification for drawing oxygen out of the atmosphere?
Well, yeah, it's over 20 years, Peter. I think you just about brought out virtual medicine when I got to know you, and we were both very interested in Scanner at the time. It was just coming to the UK out of Russia. And I think we both went on the very first training course that the Russian developers held in Marlow, I think it was. And
yes, it was.
And so that's when we got to know each other. And I'm qualified as a vet. I was very conventional until I started messing around with magnets and realized I actually had quite a good biological effect as well.
A woo-woo vet, that's a strange species. There aren't many of you. There's some woo-woo healers, but not woo-woo vets. But I know you're good. Go on, sorry, I didn't mean to.
We're in a unique position. I think it was one of the homeopaths who said, I hate homeopathic vets because they've got all the position in the world to prove that everything works, and not a lot of them do the work and the research and proof because there's no placebo effect. So, you know, from that point of view, I was in a very good place. You know, the Russians had never used Scanner on animals before, and I asked Galina in our training session if they'd used much on Scanner on animals, and she said, no, not really. And I said to her, is there any reason why not? And she said, no, not really. And I said, okay, sold. So
sold to the gentleman in grey, yes.
So from there on in, I started using Scanner with treating horses and dogs. And obviously, because the training we did was how to treat people, I also worked as a human practitioner treating people as well. So as you say, you know, once you've sort of made that leap and realize, yes, these things aren't only possible, they actually happen, then, you know, I did a lot of background reading, obviously read your book, and go into, you know, realize that biophysics is actually the fundamental background and science behind life, and not biochemistry. Biochemistry arises from biophysics. And once you sort of realize that we're all vibration and with particles and fields and all the rest of it, then frequency makes so much more sense as a medium for influencing the body. It's just then a question of getting that right influence, and that's the difficult bit. You know, it's not that frequency medicine doesn't work. The difficulty is there is such a vast spectrum of frequencies. Choosing the right one and delivering it in the right way is the tricky bit. And you know, was it what was his name, the guy who did all Nikola Tesla? Someone asked him how much force did he need to bring down the Empire State Building, and he said about 6 pounds. You just got to get the right frequency of the building and it will shatter, you know, and fall down. And you know, that shows the power and the influence that frequency can have if you get it right. And so that was the start of my journey, really, to look at all sort of new things, and you know, our paths have crossed at various times since.
Right, great. A couple of things you brought up. I just want to clarify something. You used the word scanar, and
Yes.
people may not know what that is these days. It's a very complicated Russian word. But these days, we tend to call it microcurrent therapy because there are quite a few of these devices around. The original beast that came out of Russia was called a scanar.
Yes.
And they were miraculous. Roger got one. I bought one at the same meeting that you did. I hadn't a clue how to switch it on and off. And I'm fond of telling people, actually, I went back to Spain with this device and I said to there's a little old lady who was a friend, you know, I sort of visited her, I talked to her about food allergies and things, but she was more of a friend, an old granny. She had arthritis in the knee. So I said, I'll tell you what, let's do an experiment. I'll treat your right knee with this device. And then tomorrow you can compare it with your left knee and see how much better or worse it is, or hopefully it's better. So we did that, 15 minutes of the scanar on one knee. Next day I went back and said, well, what's the difference? She said, well, the pain's gone out of both knees. And it never came back in all the 6 months I was there. I mean, I don't know her subsequent history. Yeah. But I also wanted to speak to what you were saying about life and energies. And think life is basically electrical, isn't it? I like to point out there isn't much difference between me and a corpse, you know, except that I'm moving around, I'm alive. The corpse has got all the stuff, it's got all the molecules, all the biochemistry, the enzymes, all the bits. Everything's there, but it's not working. What's the difference? And the answer is electricity, especially the membrane potential at the surface of the cells, as you know. Yeah. So, forgotten her name, the lady that wrote Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, wasn't it, that wrote Frankenstein. She wasn't wrong when she was hanging around waiting for lightning. I just think it would be a bit of an abrupt wake up. Anyway, we're going to be talking about information as a phenomenon. And information can be carried in all sorts of ways. And of course, the master information carrier is DNA, and we're going to explore that quite deeply. But, you know, information has become big in biology now. Like I said, it used to be stuff, you know, but any half intelligent idiot has got to realize the stuff isn't alive necessarily. That's the stuff, but a corpse is the same stuff. So we're looking at information, and I have a saying, I'm sure I've used it in front of you, Roger, that information implies consciousness. Yeah. I mean, otherwise, what does information mean if there's nothing there to rationalize and reason with it? So it's very important. And of course, the big thing today is Rupert Sheldrake and his morphogenetic fields. It actually goes back a bit further than that. I'd just like to mention Hans Drischer, who came up, a German guy, Victorian guy, I should say. I don't want to give his dates, but somewhere back then, long ago.
He's got a long brain.
He came up with the idea of entelechy. I think he was the person that originated that phrase. I don't know if you remember it from med school or vet school, I should say. But in was it phylogeny, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that's it. That we're all a sort of package of things and we grow from one different species into another species. You know, as we grow, we change throughout the whole, I think that was Hans Drischer anyway. I might be wrong, listen, that's not important. But, you know, he had this concept of entelechy or information fields creating life, and he can't have been, well, that he was scoffed at because he espoused, and we espouse, don't we, something called vitalism. Yes. We think it's a living, breathing, speaking, thinking cosmos, and stuff, you know, has a life of its own, basically. And that's called vitalism. It's totally unacceptable. You know, the whole of the scientific canon today is that everything's just stuff. It's only stuff and there isn't anything else but stuff. And you loonies that think some of it's alive or conscious, you know, you're just nutters. So he was discredited, but he was able to clone an animal in 1884.
Wow.
He must have known something. When did they do Dolly the sheep? Can you remember?
Absolutely, yes.
It said 80s, was it? Yeah, it wasn't 90s. It must
have
been
late 80s, early 90s, I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, you should know it was a sheep, so I'll quote you on that.
Very long. Aged at the rate that the cells had been taken from that they cloned, and that was the problem. They sort of regrew her, but she aged very quickly once she was sort of fully grown.
Ah, okay. Of course, I don't know the story on Drischer's animal.
No.
But anyway, so, you know, back to this idea of information and DNA. And we're going to talk about, well, sorry, I've just realized that, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Roger's friends aren't going to know who the hell, who he.
Yeah, who
Well,
are you?
he's Dr. Keith Scott-Mumby, a British trained medical doctor. We have Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery over there, but I got an international MD, and I live and work and enjoy life in Las Vegas, retired long ago, so I don't have to look through anybody's, down the back of their throat or anything anymore. I write about health, and I'm particularly associated with advanced holistic and alternative medicine, I suppose, and that's why I'm here talking with my good buddy Roger. We're both on the same wagon, so here we go. But let me start with I'm going to have to look at Vlail. That's right, Vlail Kazhnecheyev, a Russian, many years ago, carried out a remarkable experiment where he had two separate chambers, glass-sealed chambers, one full of infected cells, the other one full of quite healthy cells, no virus particles. He shone light through the unhealthy flask into the healthy one, and boom, viruses appeared in the in the healthy cells. Now, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that energy is kind of operating on information, doesn't it? Something changed, and therefore it implies energy.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't know what the hell energy. Have you got any definition of energy, Rog? We don't know what the hell it is. Nobody. You can't touch it, feel it, hold it. It's a speculation that there's this thing called energy.
Yeah.
And the only way we can pinpoint is to say, well, something changed. That flask of cold water is now 10 degrees warmer. We blame energy for doing that, but we haven't a clue how and why. But in this case, the energy picked up information, transmitted it to a different place, and that information became real. Okay, I've been talking too long. What do you want to say? We're going to talk about a man called Dr Gariaev. Have you got a picture of him to show us?
I have.
All right, that's him, yes. In English, we tend to call him Peter Gariaev, but it's Pyotr or something in real Russian, isn't it?
Yeah. Peter Petrovich, I think, was the PP bit. Yeah, so he is quite a special guy. So, as I said to you before, Keith, I'd heard a lot about Peter Gariaev's work, but I hadn't actually realized that it was him who did it, because I heard about his later work associated with him first, and then realized that he was the guy who led the Russian team that investigated DNA. So at the time, the West was looking at DNA and trying to sequence the human genome, and they decided that only something like 5% of it was actually usable, and the rest of it they called junk DNA. And I think that's pretty largely been debunked these days. But Peter realized that actually the chances of 95% of DNA being junk was pretty well on zero. So he amassed a team of experts, not just sort of biochemists and geneticists, but also linguistics experts. And what he discovered was that what we considered to be junk DNA was actually an overlap of 3 different language syntaxes. And they also realized, so sort of language syntax gives basis, gives background, meaning to the words in a book. So the words have a certain meaning, but the words around it also add to that meaning, and that's what he realized was happening with DNA.
Can we use the word grammar instead of verbal syntax? Some people might be more familiar with that.
Yeah.
A kind of way of speaking, like DNA has a language and a way of speaking. Yeah,
that's right. And the other interesting thing was he realized that the language that the grammar of the DNA matched the language of the spoken language of the person or wherever region that they came from. So it sort of then begs the question, which came first? Did we learn language and our own grammar and how we speak it? Is that because of our DNA? And I would think it's quite possibly that's how language was evolved originally. It was that information from the DNA influenced our vocal cords and how we developed and the language and everything else. But So a fascinating, journey of understanding DNA. And he also realized there'd been some Russian guys, one called Gurchev and the other called Lubachev, who had postulated back in the 1920s that DNA functioned on a field and particle sort of basis, and wasn't just nucleotide bases like Crick and Watson had discussed.
Right.
And so
Are we talking I didn't quite catch the name. Was it Gurwitch or somebody I'd known as
Gurwitch? Yeah.
He had onion roots that were transmitting, didn't he? And he found if he put well, it was different. Anyway, by glass, it was okay, but if they put a quartz plate in, then it couldn't transmit. Ergo, it was some kind of infrared light. I mean, that was that guy, wasn't it?
I think so.
Which is very fascinating. Yeah.
So I mean, the Russians have been ahead of understanding frequency and fields and all the different particles. Way ahead of the rest of us.
Decades. But the rest of the world scoffs because they're not proper. They don't stick to this stuff. They come up with all these wacky ideas about energy and information and fields. Sorry, I just whacked my microphone then. They're often dismissed because their scientific methods are scoffed in the West. But, you and me scoff at Western science. It's basically baloney dressed up as something intelligent.
Well, the trouble is the West, we're trying to do the science to fit what we think the narrative already is. Whereas in Russia, they did proper science, that they had ideas and they experimented and they weren't restricted by the thoughts of the day, and they had independent thought and followed it through and did all the work to prove, and then drew the conclusions from that, which is, of course, how science is supposed to work. It's
supposed to be, isn't it? Yeah, but in the West, I mean, how many times do you hear people say, I'm going to do an experiment to prove that? Fill in anything you like. How can you do an experiment to prove? You're going to do an experiment to find out what is the truth, and it might not be what you think. Yeah. And if you say, I'm going to do an experiment to prove that gravity is real or something, then of course you're going to prove it because that's what you set out to do.
Yeah,
but consciousness has tremendous powers. Anyway, let's circle around a bit, Rog, before we get to Peter and in depth, which is most fascinating work, as you say. Lovely man, no longer with us, and a lot of people are very concerned, shall we say. I don't want to do the conspiracy thing, but was he popped off because he was a bit inconvenient and going in the wrong direction, away from the money and towards the truth? Who knows? He doesn't look that old to have just popped off, to be honest. Anyway, I'm going to sort of mention something from my book here, right? Medicine Beyond. If you haven't got it, you should.
Yeah.
Because it's full of good stuff. But one of the things that Roger doesn't even know about is an experiment that was done by a Chinese who was called Sean Kanchen.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to source all this, but I got part of the original paper. Long story short, he took eggs from ducks and eggs from chickens and shone laser light through the duck eggs onto the chicken eggs. Remember, these are just embryos. They're still eggs. And so somewhat plastic and formable, I suppose, is the inference. Anyway, long story short, some of the chicks, when they hatched, had a kind of duck-type bill and a webbing on their feet.
Yep.
That is very strange, unless you put it into exactly the context that Roger's talking to us about, which is DNA is information and it's carrying the story, and you transmit the story to the, obviously the chick egg cells must have got very muddled. They got completely confused. I thought, wait, what do I want web feet for? Web? Oh, okay, that's what it says.
I wonder, Keith, did they only had webbing on one foot? Did it swim in a circle?
No, but that's more like the scientists going around, I think, in circle with 1 foot nailed to the floor. Anyway, come on, Fred, tell us about Luc Montagnier, because he's one of our big heroes. He's an amazing person. He did get the Nobel Prize. That was to do with finding and developing the HIV virus, or the HI virus, I should say.
Yeah. Well, before we go on to Luc, I just want to, Peter actually did a very similar experiment. So I've got a couple of slides about it, which I sort of call the proof. So what he did was he got some salamander embryos, and he got some frog spawn and tadpoles, and a laser. Fired the low power laser through the salamander embryos onto the frog spawn and tadpoles, and guess what came out the other side?
Tadmanders, I suppose.
Well, what happened is they grew as adult salamanders. So that was the proof that the DNA information could be carried with the laser from the salamander embryos onto the frog spawn tadpoles, and because they were close enough related, that DNA information was able to be transferred. So that was
that's really awesome. Yeah,
awesome experiment. Yeah.
So you didn't get, just the odd modification. You got full-on adult salamanders. How long did he play the laser light? Do you know? I mean, those kinds of things are often missing. But I mean, was it for weeks or just a few hours?
I don't know is the honest answer, but I'd imagine sort of the influence. He kept the influence going as they developed, and that's probably why he got such a complete development, I suppose.
Right. Now, that's a brilliant experiment by a brilliant mind. Have you got any idea whether anyone's tried to replicate this or not? Have you looked for that?
I mean, certainly, yeah, people have.
I mean, Kenshin's thing would kind of go along with it, wouldn't it? So they're self-supporting, but
yeah. I mean, and you've got to have that certain degree of association and relative similarity between the different species to get that change as well. I mean, I don't think you could take a duck and a rabbit and try and make some sort of chimera with a laser. I don't think there's sufficient overlap in their DNA. So the Chinese guy had to use 2 birds, and Peter had to use 2 amphibians to come up with the same result.
Yeah. No, fascinating. If you got another one that belongs in this slot, show us. Otherwise, go back to Luc Montagnier then, and he's responsible for several things. Do you remember the one? What do they call it? Not the ghost of DNA.
Phantom DNA.
In fact, yeah, phantom DNA, and the telekinesis of DNA. Some of the newspapers said. Yeah.
They always usually get the wrong end of the stick there.
Yeah.
So Luc Montagnier did a similar experimental proof. So he basically, I think a lot of people know what PCR is these days after the last couple of years, but basically it's a way of amplifying small amounts of material to make sure that it's there. So what he did in this experiment, so he had some DNA, and if you do a PCR and amplify it up, you get a lot of DNA in this second tube over here. And if there's no DNA, you put in the PCR process, and of course nothing is amplified, so it's not there, so you end up with nothing in the second one. So this was sort of the basis of his experiment. So what he did in his first one was he had some DNA in this first tube over here, and he diluted it pretty much to homeopathic levels. And what they found was that it was obviously, because as we've said, we're all parts of particles and fields, so everything in the universe is emitting its own electromagnetic signal. So in the second tube here, you've got electromagnetic signals being emitted from this second tube.
Right. Now that was
then he went on to
Jacques Benveniste got to electromagnetic signatures in the end, didn't he? In fact, George Lakhovsky was the first. His book Secret of Life, he said everything has a frequency. An atom has a frequency, a molecule has a frequency, the cell has a frequency, the organ has a frequency, and the body has a frequency. And they all add up and muddle up with each other. But unfortunately, if you get something like a cancer, it's got a pretty powerful signature.
Well, it just neutralizing that. Of course, Raymond Rife used that principle with his Rife machine to cure people. And it was documented in the 1930s. And he did an experiment, didn't he? I think it was on lung cancer, and they took 20 people and he cured 16 of them. because they followed the protocol, and it was actually published, but then obviously buried after that. And he went back to the 4 who he didn't manage to cure, and he said to them, look, the reason why I didn't cure you is because you've been wrongly diagnosed. You've got a different type of cancer. And so he then treated them with the correct frequency for that cancer, and they were cured as well.
Yes, yeah, remarkable stuff, which lives on in legend, of course. But I've got to tell you, I don't believe anything to do with modern Rife machines. They're missing critical parts of the data, you know, the carrier wave with the frequencies. It's all been decoded, but, you know, for 50 years, people have been preaching and teaching the wrong thing, basically. But yes, the story, you know, Rife's work is absolutely along these lines, pivotal. Yeah. Sorry, anyway, interrupted, but you know, we're here to discuss things. It's 2 guys having a chin wag. We're not doing a lecture to students.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, you know, and what you're saying about everything having a frequency, it's the basis of bioresonance. You know, I use bioresonance in my vet work now, and, you know, anything and everything has the potential to be a remedy, and to be used for getting the right influence on something. So, you know, it's,
well, we're going to come in a minute, aren't we, to one of Gariaev's experiments where he shone the frequency of healthy pancreas into diseased pancreas. You know, he deliberately diseased them, poisoned the pancreas. But if you shone in strongly the healthy pancreas signal, the animals survived and actually started to grow new pancreases. So in a way, that's what George Lokowski called the battle of the frequencies. You know, whichever is the winning frequency is what you get. And if the cancer wins, you get cancer. If the healthy organ signal wins, you survive and your organ goes back to normal. Yeah. Anyway, come on, step 2. Yes.
Step 2. Okay, so he had a tube over here that had some DNA in it that was emitting its electromagnetic signal. And what they found was this second tube that had nothing in it, after 18 hours of just being pure water, was being placed nearby to this first tube, it started emitting the very same electromagnetic signal of the DNA, even though it supposedly had nothing in it.
Right, and that, I mean, you can't actually get DNA bases out of water because, you know, there's more than just oxygen and hydrogen, carbon notably, and so on. Yeah. So it's odd, isn't it, that it picked up the frequency, but not actually well, maybe not. I mean, you know, I've been talking about stuff. So there was definitely no stuff in the second tube, and yet it was emanating a frequency and information. That's a fascinating experiment, isn't it?
And then he went on to step 3, where he then took this second tube from over here that had supposedly just pure water in it, but was emitting the electromagnetic signal. And he did the PCR amplification on it, and was able then, because they put some material that could make DNA into the PCR mixture, it then organized those nucleotides and everything into the same order as the original DNA. And amplified it up with the PCR to prove that it was there.
Right. I mean, to me, an experiment like that is fascinating because it's a mixture of woo-woo and stuff. You know, like you can do the stuff to woo and say, oh, it could be just baloney. But then you take the woo-woo stuff and it turns back into something physical. You've got to be on the right lines. The explanation is very close, isn't it, with an experiment like this?
It is. I mean, and it's just amazing that Luc Montagnier had his Nobel Prize, you know, and he started talking about this in the West and had such derision and was attacked so badly. He ended up having to move to China. To do the work and carry on his work, which is just, you know, ridiculous.
Well, it's the myth that Western science is about the truth. It's not. It's about dollars and, you know, just making money. And they were happy to bend the scientific truth to just make more money. And we've seen, you know, we've lived through 2 years of that exact thing, haven't we, Ross?
But I mean, Luke didn't stop the experiment there. He actually went on to do a bit more. So what he found was that this
step 4,
this DNA was identical with the sequence. You know, there was one base out, 102 out of 104. So the probability of this DNA having 102 correct sequences is mind-bogglingly small. And they repeated this 22 times with the same results. So it was repeatable, good science that he was doing, and proved that this worked. But
was it the adenine base each time that fluffed, or was it a different base each time?
I don't know, but I mean, it was, 98% identical. It was, I mean, but our DNA doesn't replicate with 100% accuracy, which is, we'll go on to talk Peter's work on as to why that's important. So our own DNA, when our cells are replicating and reproducing, aren't 100% accurate. So it's, this is an amazing result. It's it's quite staggering. But he then didn't stop there. He went on, and so they digitized and recorded this electromagnetic signal.
What's HADO? What's HADO?
We can look it up. The important bit was he digitized this signal, and he then emailed it to somebody else, who then basically repeated, took that signal and put it to pure water again in another tube, and did the same PCR amplification of it, and ended up with the same sequence as the one that he'd started, in another continent over here, before he'd emailed it. So it was quite incredible. And then the other bit, which was the real proof, was the DNA had originally been taken from some bacteria. So what they did was they put some human cell cultures, and then they used this emailed solution, and it created the same disease process that the original bacteria would normally cause, which proved that DNA transmission had been successful and hadn't really lost anything. So the interesting thing was that it proved that DNA works on a field and wave level. It proved the information could be captured. It proved that the information could be transmitted, and more importantly, it proved that the transferred information is coherent, because there's all very well, I think, they said they can put all the information in the world into a glass of water. They just couldn't work out how to get it out again. So you've got to be able to keep that information coherent so that it can be retrieved, and it proved that the received information has effect. So, that work was just, mind-blowing in terms of its implication of how frequency and DNA is working on electromagnetic levels, and not just on nucleotide levels, which is, of course, what the Russians had been saying in the 1920s. So, it proved a number of different ideas on a number of different levels.
Yeah, so reminiscent of my friend Jack Benveniste. I mean, he got hammered for the memory of water thing, but he ended up doing electromagnetic stuff towards the end, and he had these signatures. It wasn't just DNA. He like acetylcholine and other biologically active compounds, and he had them put through a transducer into a sort of digital signal and sent us floppy disks, email attachments, and sent to the Northwest University in Illinois, Chicago, I think it was. It can't have been Northwest. Anyway, a reputable university. It was no fly buzz university, but they would put it through a transducer, and it would reappear with the message of acetylcholine, which would change the heart rate of a lab specimen. No stuff there whatsoever, just no stuff. Yeah. And it's one of my proofs, actually, in my book, Medicine Beyond, that there are 3 ways you can prove you do not need stuff to get a biological effect. Electromagnetic signatures like this is one of them. Homeopathy is another. Of course, everybody laughs at homeopathy because there's nothing there. It's diluted and there's nothing left. There's no stuff, but it does have an effect, Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of quite good studies as to how effective it is.
Yeah, actually, I met Luc Montagnier a few years ago, about 2017, 2018, I can't remember which one it was. And we had dinner, we had lunch together, and we were just talking a bit like you and I having a chat. And he was telling me that the DNA helix, the gap between the helix layers effectively is actually exactly the van der Waals length of water. And so there was
explain what van der Waals length of water is, please.
There are van der Waals forces that hold molecules of water together in a liquid. And so it's got a certain frequency and energy. So that bond length is sort of set, or gap between the water molecules is set by that frequency and energy. And so what he was suggesting, that maybe the water between the layers of the DNA actually held the information, held the frequency of, because we know water's got memory, actually held some of that information of the DNA. But so it's, you know, fascinating conversation, and yeah, just a
very amazing man. He too, sadly, is no longer with us. I don't think. I know. I've of no suspicion he was.
No, I think he wasn't very. He wasn't very well, I don't think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so what other treat have you got for us next then?
Well,
I mean, one of the simple, go back to the simple stuff that Peter did. I mean, he took these seeds from Chernobyl, didn't he, that were as dead can be, that had been irradiated and blasted. They were double-decker dead, and yet by irradiating them, he brought them back to life, and they sprouted and germinated.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to the the rat experiment, where this has got an interesting aspect to it. Not only, so I'll go through the.
Are you talking the alloxan experiment?
Yes.
All right. Well, will you explain it in detail for our listeners?
Okay. So what Peter did was, he had, obviously, for those who don't know, lab rats are grown as families, so that any experiment that's done on using rats as test animals, you've got a very close familial link, genetic link between all the different individuals, so that you can draw conclusions between different groups of rats and say, well, they're effectively genetically identical, therefore any difference between the groups can't be explained through that. It has to be a real effect of whatever you're using for your experiment. So what he did was, he had two groups of rats, and he as you say, gave alloxan, which is a toxin that knocks out the pancreas of one of the groups. And then, he did it to all of the rats, and half of them, he took the frequency of healthy pup rats, and he played that frequency of healthy pancreas to half of the rats that he given the toxin to. And obviously, as you'd expect, the rats that had no treatment at all, they died. The alloxan, once the pancreas isn't functioning, their metabolism degenerated, and they weren't able to survive. But the group that he used the frequency of the healthy rats with, they all survived. But there's another aspect to it, I don't know if you're aware of, Keith, is that he divided that group into three. So there was one group that he had in the same, and he was using sound as a way of using of transferring the information from the healthy rats. So he had.
So it wasn't laser light this time; it was sound.
No, he was using sound,
because that was Luc Montagnier. The other guy, Jacques Benveniste's work. He ended up using sound frequencies. You know, you get these sort of millions and billions of frequencies down to sort of measurable audio levels. That's fascinating in itself. Go on.
So he put a third of the group that he was treating in the same room as the sound source. He put another group in the room next door, so about 5-10 meters away from the sound source, and he put the third group of treated rats 20 kilometers away, and they all healed.
Oh, well, of course that fits with non-locational stuff, doesn't it? You know, we're into that's the quantum physics has dragged us kicking and screaming into the fact space and time doesn't mean shit. Non-local, you know, it could have sent it to the planet Mars. It would still had the same effect, because it's not about space and distance. And therefore, it's non-attenuating. We can infer that as well, can't we? No matter how far away you are, the signal doesn't get weaker, and like some fields like magnetism, the field gets weaker and weaker the further out you go. These information fields, life fields that we're talking about, they don't attenuate, and that's,
I mean, it's just
totally fascinating.
I think it's like entanglement, isn't it, where you can take two electrons and it doesn't matter how far apart you have them, once they've been entangled, you have an action on one, and the second one immediately, without any time lapse, changes its position or rotation or spin or whatever you're using to identify the entanglement. And it sort of defies that whole speed of light thing, doesn't it? Because
spooky, as Einstein said. He couldn't hack it, could he? That can't happen, therefore it doesn't.
Yeah. So
you should wish.
And I think the Chinese have. I think they've taken some entangled electrons up into space, and they've done a huge distance between entangled electrons to prove that entanglement is real. So
I'd have to look at the details of that, Rog, wouldn't you? I mean, how do you get the signal back? That was the split second when the other electron changed, and this one changed as well. How do you know? How do you get the signal back that it would instantaneously did the same thing? Anyway, that's not for our discussion. I'll go and look it up afterwards. But to me, that's a quite slightly fascinating question. Yeah. Anyway, let's sum up the alloxan experiment again. For that, not everyone is scientific or already switched on to. They need it laying out, and they need to understand. This is one of the most important experiments ever carried out in science. At the end of the 20th century, Dr Gariaev did this experiment. He gave rats a deadly poison called alloxan that knocks out their pancreas. They die. It's 100% fatal. Yeah. But by shining you said it was, didn't you? Not shining light, but by using a sound signal that represented the energetic signature of healthy pancreas, he was able to save half of them. They didn't die. Well, it was over 98% anyway, survived, didn't they? Yeah. Because they'd had the healthy pancreas signal, and it enabled them to overcome the pancreas toxin. Yeah. It's amazing. And why isn't medicine doing this? This is, in fact, it puts me in mind of Carlo Rubbia. I don't know if you know who he was, but he was the 1986 Nobel laureate for physics. Right. And he said, and I can only sort of paraphrase, but 99.99%, it was 1 billionth with a B. Only 1 billionth of the universe is matter, is stuff. Everything else is information and energy. Yes. And so science, and especially medicine, that's completely stuck on 1 billionth of the problem, of the issue. How can it get things right? There's no wonder medicine is floundering and people are dying anyway. It's the whole reductionist paradigm, isn't it, where they focus on a smaller and smaller or ever smaller bit of the picture and then lose sight of the big picture altogether. Right. Did you ever hear that joke when you were in training, that especially is somebody who knows more and more about less and less? It seems to sum it up very well. I think it's absolutely true. Yeah. It's absolutely true. The other thing about Peter's alloxan experiment is that it was actually repeated. Someone else did it as well, and they did some histology. So they did the pathology. They looked at the healthy recovered rats at their pancreas and realized that it had completely recovered and regenerated effectively. So the proof of the science is the reproducibility of it, and we're talking about all this reproducibility that's being done, not necessarily all in the same era, but there are great scientists who have established that they are great scientists who are repeating these experiments and getting results, and yet still science ignores them and says it's not possible. It's just mind-blowing in its ignorance. Right. This puts me in mind of homeopathic sarcodes. I know you know homeopathy. We often administer pathological or mimicking remedies, but one of the techniques is to give healthy tissue signal in homeopathy, isn't it? That's what we call a sarcode. And if you're treating someone for, a lung disease, say, give them some healthy lung sounds and signals. It's very much along these lines too. So it's a kind of reinforcement for homeopathy, which has been around like 200 years or more. Yeah, yeah. we know it works. You know, had wonderful results. Now I'm going to ask you about a legend, almost, or a legendary piece that again Peter Gariaev supposedly shone signals from a young man into an old lady who started growing teeth. Did you come across that story? Growing new teeth?
I know they've done one tooth experiment. I didn't know that one, but I know they took a human tooth and some stem cells, and they implanted it into a dog's jaw, and they managed to get that to grow as a human tooth in the dog's jaw by using the sound frequencies of healthy teeth. Yeah.
Right. Well, I'll take the one I heard then as a probable. I mean, you know, it's more than an urban legend, I think, but maybe you've got the details right. And I can't remember where I picked it up, to be honest. As you know, some of these publications are very sketchy. You know, I can't read Russian.
No.
Sometimes it's from German sources who've translated the Russian. I can't speak German either. It can be very frustrating. But it fits with the model. You know, if you give somebody, I mean, my God, I mean, can you imagine what would, if that turned out to be something to follow up, that, you know, you've lost all your teeth and you've got rotten gums, just bring some kid along and shine it through his head and bang, you grow a new set.
Yeah,
this is the medicine of the future. You know, I've been talking ever since I wrote the book Virtual Medicine. As you know, the theme was, you know, using digital and not real stuff, but digital and informational, that we can produce transformations. And the time may come when remedies, you know, even like aspirins or penicillin, is given as a digital signal. You don't need the actual stuff.
Yeah.
I speculated in my book whether you'd actually get rid of the side effects that way. I've no way of knowing. Have you? It would be just a guess.
I know
anyway,
some Bulgarians who've done that work.
Sorry, go again.
There are some Bulgarians who've done that work, and they took a digitalized signature, if you like, of aspirin, and they gave it to some experimental mice, and of course aspirin thins the blood, and they proved it by looking at the clotting time of the blood, that the digital signal of the aspirin could be transferred and could be given to the mice using that method.
Right. Well, you know, I'm sure it's coming. Again, I speculated in my virtual medicine, by the way, I talked about, is now this, you know, let me show you again, plug. Oh, you haven't got a book, have you, Rog? Because we'll plug it. What I said was, I've forgotten the point I was going to make now. It was from that. It was something to do with digital remedies. Oh, yes, to do with vitamins and minerals. I think I would draw the line at saying, no, just take some digital zinc, you'll be all right. I think I'd rather the person took the actual zinc, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think it's yeah. I can't quite work out what, in theory it should work, but whether you would get enough of the signal on an ongoing basis, I suspect that's possibly where it falls down.
It may be a step too far. Although, having said that, I mean, he just showed us a brilliant experiment where DNA substance appeared through a digital transformation in a different place. So maybe you could digitally get some, you know, some zinc atoms to appear where you want them. Anyway, I don't know. But now, what I want to do now, because I know you're involved with Gariaev's work, you know, in like committed, as it were, and you've got things that you want to talk about that are, well, equipment, shall we say, you know, ongoing from Gariaev's work. So please now lead us in that direction, Roger, and tell us what you got. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I can't wait.
Okay, so this is sort of, if you like, a bit of a diagrammatic representation of what happens to our DNA from the time we're born at age 0 to death, assuming that we don't, you know, we die at a sort of fairly old age of natural causes, whatever that is. And so there's a definition of life or our lives is that we are managing our deterioration of our DNA, because, as we said before, DNA doesn't replicate with 100% accuracy as cells divide and as we get older. And you know,
that's where we need our telomeres, right? We've got that model now. It protects the DNAs for quite a ways from deteriorating, but inevitably it's going to happen.
Well, yeah, and of course, the telomeres don't protect the DNA from things like electromagnetic radiation, which as we go into the microwave frequencies are going to be closer to the lengths of the DNA and cause more damage in DNA. But that's another story.
Mm-hmm.
But so the DNA basically it sort of slowly deteriorates, and as we get older, it picks up speed. So you get a bit of a speeding up towards the end. And the reason this is I quite like this diagram is because if you look at the line, it's like little blocks. So I like to think of our DNA deterioration a little bit like a blockchain, and each block has information. And whenever there's a damage to the DNA, whether it's through replication or some external influence, our DNA moves to the next block and it gets deteriorated. But this block remains.
That's a bit of fractal science, isn't it? I think that, Roger, the rough or smooth universe. You're showing it's definitely rough, and of course the fractal model says definitely it's a rough universe. It bumps from one bit to the next.
Yeah. So this is what Peter basically discovered was obviously at the beginning of our life, you've got the information of a healthy baby. Hopefully we've been born healthy and happy and all the rest of it. So that's the best version of us that we're ever going to be, for the vast majority of people. And obviously, as we get older, that information determines how healthy we are, comes from this deteriorated DNA. So what Peter had the genius concept to work out was, well, if I take this information here, like from this picture of this baby, if I can use that information and project it onto an older person, or that person when they're older, then they will be healthy and happy. And what he discovered was that this photograph here effectively creates a link to the DNA information at that time that can be accessed. And what Peter did was he used some special lasers, and he fires the laser onto the photograph of the baby or the child, person, up to whatever age that they are, and the reflection of that laser light is a link back to that DNA information. And what Peter said is basically that the world, the universe, is a hologram, and every incident, everything that happens within the universe creates a new node, if you like, within the hologram. And so this photograph represents a node in that universal hologram that through his lasers he can access it, grab that information and convert it into a sound file, a bit like he did with the Loxan experiment. And by playing it back to us, we hear our own DNA from that earlier node, and it helps our body to go back to that healthy time. And in rejuvenating our DNA to that time, any diseases we currently have are, effectively healed, or our body is then given the information to heal it.
Right, so this information in a photograph. Now, the first thing I thought when I heard this, you've got to think of the native tribesmen, the people up country in Papua New Guinea, and that. Oh, you take them spirit, in the camera. He's got my spirit. Maybe there's something to that. Whoa!
I had exactly that same thought when I heard it, because I knew that story as well. I used to see it on some of the old films, don't they? The cowboy and Indian films, and there's I don't want to.
My spirit. So there might be something to. I'll tell you what else it made me think of, and that's the work of George de la Warr, who was a radionics wizard back in the 20s and 30s. He invented this amazing camera, Roger, and what he could do was photograph out of time and space.
Wow.
He would put a seed in the frame and take a picture, and it would show the plant, not the seed. The picture would be the plant that it was going to grow into. Yeah. And he'd take a picture of someone who was, say, 50 years old. And I don't know what the tweakings were, but he could set the camera. So although the people in front of the camera were in their 50s, a married couple, it showed them as they were on their wedding day, complete with wedding dress. I mean, some of this stuff is mind-boggling. Anyway, listen, I'm getting very excited, and I'm interrupting you. So in a photograph, there's enough information to carry youthfulness. Maybe this is where I got the story about, you know, a young boy to an old woman, that she started regrowing teeth. Anyway, pick up your story. I did interrupt, and I'm sorry, but that's exciting, isn't it? Hey, I'm jumping up and down.
It's so exciting. And it's difficult not to get excited when we're talking about it, because it is, you know, the potentials of it are massive. And so some of the things that they've done, you know, he's got his Institute of Linguistics that he was working with, and, you know, thankfully his team carries on working, and his wife leads the team now, and keeps the work going. But they've done some amazing work where, obviously, if a child is born with a congenital disorder, even something like Down syndrome, where you've got the extra 21 chromosome, if you take the sibling's photograph and you use the sound file made from that sibling photograph, it will, and then play it to the baby that's been born with Down syndrome, they develop without the Down's symptoms and characteristics.
Wow.
And they've done this with cystic fibrosis. They've done it, you know, they're doing it helping kids with autism. So it's something that can be used at any stage of life. I mean, Peter on video, he said, you know, if a baby's sound file was generated at their birth and they listen to it on a regular basis, he doesn't see why that person couldn't live to be 1,000 years old. But of course, it isn't a license to abuse your body. You can't just, you know, when you're older, go out and start drinking and eating bad food and all the rest of it. You know, you've got, it's part of a process that keeps the body healthy. But everything else has got to be right as well. But it, you know, it does bring back fascinating.
Anything that helps, you know.
Oh, absolutely. You know, I mean, I've always said that I want to die healthy. I want to die old, but I want to die healthy, you know. And this is, you know, potentially a way, if we can keep our DNA at a stage where, you know, we were happy and healthy, and that influence we listen to on a regular enough basis, then there's no reason why that can't continue.
Yeah. Fascinating. I mean, people are going to be picking up their, you know, their file prepared when they're infants and playing it for life. It's going to come. I can see it.
Well, absolutely. Imagine
the medical profession won't like it because people will stay healthy, but you know, to screw the medical profession, we all want to be healthy. We don't want doctors who are clever. We don't want disease. So we don't need doctors.
Well, I mean, that's the sort of big misnomer, isn't it? We call it a health industry, and actually it isn't. It's an illness industry. What we want to do is we want to turn it into a health industry. And, you know, people should only really need treatment when something goes majorly wrong. You know, an ultimate, exactly. Is it the Chinese? They used to have the system where the doctors were paid for all the healthy people, all their healthy clients, and they didn't get paid when they became sick, and it incentivized.
So it's sad, isn't it? I think it's more than an urban legend. I think it's true.
Yeah.
A great system, of course.
Well, absolutely.
If you get rewarded for sick people, what do you get? You want sick people, you know. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Go on.
I mean, that's the basis of wave genetics, really. And you know, when I heard what had happened to Peter, I contacted his wife and said, look, you know, Peter's work is just too important, and it, you know, it can't be buried, because he was nominated for a Nobel Prize for medicine.
Rightly so. Yeah.
So, you know, and I think, you know, adds to the question mark over his death, doesn't he? Where, you know, once you get to the point where Nobel Prizes are being mentioned for work like this that is paradigm changing, there are huge vested interest, shall we say, in maintaining the status quo, and that's what that, you know, draws up some questions. Yeah.
So what if people want to pursue this, or they want to, are you offering them the possibility that they can get their sound file of their earlier self from a baby photo, and you can process that for them and supply it? Is that what we're leading to here?
It is. I mean, wow. I don't do that. I haven't got the equipment to actually do the processing. I sort of, I'm the conduit, if you like, to back to the lab, and they do all the work and then send it back to me, and I distribute it out. But it's just a way of trying to get get it available and get it out there so that this sort of work maintains and doesn't get squashed. And I've actually got I've got an idea. I don't know what you think, Keith, that if one of the big side effects that people often report in the testimonials is that they feel joy, they feel connected, they feel spiritual balance as well. And I honestly,
that's a rare side effect from medicines, I must say.
Well, absolutely.
Good.
And maybe when we're born, we have that connectedness to universe that we lose as we get older. A lot of people. And I've got an idea that if enough people start using this technology, and enough people sort of get that joy and link to universe and spirit again, that it will raise the whole planetary vibration and get us out of quite the mess that we're in at the moment.
Wonderful. This is starting to sound quite scriptural. We got some DNA scriptures here, I think. Wonderful story.
I mean,
well, it's better than the claptrap that is in some book covers,
Well,
I could name, that are full of things like adultery and murder and incest and God knows what.
Well,
I think this is a much better level of scripture, to work on the being and us, and this is clearly a God-given gift, isn't it? I mean, Peter was on it. He was a scientist, but it's all out there. It's part of the universe that was created by the supreme creator, whoever or whatever that was. I'm more of a Buddhist than a Christian. I believe in that particular model or tradition, that we're all part of the greatness thing. Anything else you want to say? Otherwise, I think we might I'll ask you the leading question, which is, what do you want people to do?
People,
are they going to? I can put a link under the video on my podcast site. Is that going to help? They come to you.
That's fine. I mean, I've obviously got a website where people can come and look at the information for themselves. They've got to be happy that what they're doing is right for them. And they've got to, I always, a good scientist say, I think it was Einstein said, question everything. But, hopefully, I think we've given quite a lot of evidence that this isn't flimsy science. This is based on some real science that a number of different scientists have done different steps to prove that it is a real effect. I stand on the shoulders of all the greats who go before me, and Peter, I'm sure he certainly acknowledged that the Russian scientists who went before him that sowed that seed of DNA being field and particles and waves. So people need to be happy and then I think it gives people hope where they've been given none by the conventional medical paradigm as it is. But it's it's also not just a treatment system, it's a way that people can maintain. I mean, I think on the website I call it the ultimate biohack.
Yes,
it's because everything else that the biohackers are doing is based on their deteriorating DNA. They're trying to say, as you say, they're trying to stop the telomeres from shortening and all the rest of it, but ultimately that doesn't always stop the damage happening between the telomeres. So this is a way effectively of addressing that lack, if you like, or gap in the biohacker approach at the moment.
Right. Now, it should be clear, but we'll say it. So you're based in the UK.
Yes.
So if you're going to contact Roger, you need to allow for the time zones and things. Does the person have to send you something, or can you just do a digital copy of their image, or what?
The image is actually quite interesting. There are some, it's got to be a picture of that person, ideally up to 7 years old, when they were healthy and happy. And it's got to be a photograph of them on their own, because you want just their own DNA information. You don't, and it's even if someone's in a park and there's somebody right in the background, that will be enough for that information from the person right back, even though they're a little dot in the photograph, to effectively muddy the waters. So it's got to be a photograph of a person when they were young, or an animal. We're doing it for animals as well. Which is obviously my veterinary background. I love the idea that we can keep our dogs going for as long as we possibly can, or our horses, or cats, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so it's got, so on their own, the quality of the photograph isn't important, and they can, if they've got a hard copy, they can just scan it and send it as a JPEG, and that's all we need.
Dang.
And then do a patient questionnaire. So they fill out a questionnaire about what their medical problems are, what their history is, and what their desires are, what they want from their sound matrix, and then we send that off. It gets processed. It takes about 30 working days to process it. It's obviously, you know, it's not an overnight thing. It's not a magic wand. It takes time to actually do the work and generate the files and everything. Then it comes back to me, and I send it out on a USB stick.
Right. I was just saying, Dangus, in our family, in our house for years, there was a picture of me, a little bare-assed baby sat on a cushion about 6 months old. I wished I could get it's gone. It's long gone, you know, 50 years gone probably. Oh, my mum, bless her, she's gone, but she might have known where it was. But anyway, I don't think so. All right, so we're connecting people with you, and you will tell them what they need to do and what they need to pay and all that.
I mean, the other thing, obviously, you've just brought up a good point there, Peter, is if you haven't got a photograph of yourself, you know, a close blood relative, so, you know, sibling or daughter, son, or parents, you know, they are close enough, you know, related that the people can use that photograph. And obviously, if they used a son or daughter's photograph, then the son and daughter can use the matrix as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay. All right. Well, listen, it's been a fascinating discussion. I want to wrap it up with just one more little thing about DNA. I don't know if you know the panspermia story, that life's from space. There's DNA raining down on us from space all the time, and this is just factual, right? Yeah. But I came across, for Medicine Beyond, I came across this study with a guy called Sajtovic, and he was studying plasmas. Now, you know, there's a huge plasma only about 60 miles above our head. A plasma of things that are so fiery hot, all the atoms and molecules are just blown to pieces. It's just hot, fiery atoms. Yeah. That's a plasma. To just summarize his experiment real quickly, he was finding spirals wrapping around each other, double spiral helixes were forming in plasmas. What? Can you believe that? Above our heads, 60 miles up there, there's the sort of beginnings. I mean, everybody knows that DNA has one characteristic, which is a double helix spiral. Yeah. It's out there. DNA is just amazing. And I think, I've forgotten who it was, but anyway, it's Woodstock, some singer. Was it Janis Joplin? Sang a song anyway. We are stardust, we are golden, we are billion-year-old carbon. Do you remember that song? I can't remember the lyrics. Listen, 20 years ago, I'd have tried to sing it. But anyway, the fans would know it. It's the kind of Woodstock song. And, right. You know, we're stardust, we're golden. Sounds suddenly very possible that life comes to Earth from space, and there's now overwhelming evidence almost that is what's been happening.
Or maybe it came through on the frequencies. Okay, it's the frequencies that of those spirals that come and then manifest it in our waters. Yeah,
well, it's true, but they are finding, you know, solid biological compounds in stuff that's dropped from space. So it's a mixture of both, I'm sure. Yeah. But I bet you're right. The information part is probably the most important of what's coming down. So they'd be all religious, coming down from heaven. I'm not religious. I'm religious, but I'm not that kind of religion. I'm a different denomination. Roger, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. And we should have another go, maybe homeopathy and animals or something like that in the future.
Yeah, we should.
But this story is so unbelievable. I mean, that's the minute I heard of what Jack Benveniste was doing, I rushed to my typewriter. I said, I want to write this out. In fact, I wanted the novel, you know,
sure.
What's his name? Brian. I can't remember his name, but he writes all those funny medical novels, Coma and things like that. I thought, I want this novel, and I still haven't written it. But you know, somebody opens their computer, logs on, and they drop dead and croak because the computer had an electromagnetic signal of death. It would make a fascinating story. Of course, never solve it because nobody believe it. This is almost unbelievable. But you know, if you're open-minded, filled with love and excitement and curiosity and wisdom. These stories just come to you. It's as real can be.
Absolutely.
So thanks for talking, buddy. It's been great. Talk soon.
Will
and
do.
I will post any link you require under the video. And of course, you do what you like with your part of the video too. We're going to share it, but
we will.
This is going on my podcast site, and people will want to contact you. I just know. Take care. Take care, brother.
Good to talk.
Same to you. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.